The grandfather clock in Duke Philip Ashford's library marked each second with relentless precision, its pendulum swinging through the silence like a metronome of a life standing still. At 42, he sat motionless before the marble fireplace, his gray eyes fixed on the portrait above the mantel, not with longing, but with the hollow gaze of a man performing a ritual he no longer remembered the meaning of. 10 years. A decade had passed since consumption had stolen his Duchess, Lady Catherine, leaving him with nothing but the suffocating weight of what could never be again. The Tun spoke of Duke Philip Ashford the way one might speak of a monument, with respect, with reverence, but never with warmth. He was the Duke who had loved and lost, who had retreated into a fortress of duty and protocol while his heart calcified into something resembling stone. Society had long since accepted that the Duke of Ashford was a man who breathed but did not live, who moved through ballrooms and parliament like a spectre draped in impeccable tailoring. Philip's dark hair, untouched by gray despite the passage of time, fell across his forehead as he reviewed the morning's correspondence with mechanical precision. His face, once known for its easy smiles and quick laughter, had settled into a mask of aristocratic neutrality, handsome still, but frozen, like a statue carved from marble rather than flesh and blood. The lines around his mouth spoke of restraint rather than joy, and his eyes, though sharp with intelligence, held the distant quality of winter ice, beautiful but utterly cold. The transformation had not been sudden. In the first year after Catherine's death, his family had surrounded him with gentle insistence, urging him toward healing, toward life, toward some semblance of normalcy. His sister had brought her children to visit, hoping their laughter might thaw his grief. His closest friends had invited him to their estates, offering the comfort of companionship and the distraction of sport. But Philip had found that grief, when embraced fully enough, could become a kind of armor, and armor, once worn long enough, became impossible to remove without feeling dangerously exposed. By the second year, society had stopped expecting him to heal. By the fifth, they had stopped mentioning Catherine's name in his presence. By the 10th, Philip had become an institution unto himself, the tragic Duke, the gentleman of sorrow, the man whose very existence served as a romantic testament to the power of eternal devotion. The irony was not lost on Philip that his grief had made him more desirable. There was something exquisitely tragic about a duke who loved so deeply he could never love again, and the marriage-minded mothers of the Tun had not failed to notice. Each season brought fresh attempts to capture the interest of the untouchable Duke of Ashford, each more calculated than the last. But Philip had perfected the art of polite refusal, maintaining his reputation as a gentleman while making it abundantly clear that his heart was a closed gallery, its most precious exhibit forever behind glass. His household, led by his devoted butler Hastings and his long-suffering housekeeper Mrs. Pembroke, had learned to navigate the geography of their master's grief with the skill of cartographers. They knew which rooms to avoid, the music room where Catherine had once played the pianoforte, which topics to circumvent, anything involving children, family, or the future, and which routines to maintain with unwavering consistency. Catherine's portrait had been relocated from the main hall to Philip's private study 3 years ago, not out of a desire to forget, but because Hastings had quietly suggested that guests found it unsettling to be greeted by the ghost of the house. On this particular November morning, as Philip sat reviewing reports from his Derbyshire estate, he found his attention drifting to the windows where gray fog pressed against the glass like an uninvited visitor. The weather suited him perfectly, colorless, heavy, and utterly devoid of promise. He had long since hoped for sunshine, both literal and metaphorical, having learned that hope was an indulgence for those who had something left to lose. A soft knock interrupted his reverie, and Hastings entered with the Morning Post arranged on a silver salver with the precision of a military operation. "Your Grace," the elderly butler intoned with the formal courtesy that had characterized their relationship for the past decade. "The morning correspondence. There are several invitations requiring your attention, including one from the Dowager Countess of Lennox for her charity luncheon next week." Philip accepted the letters with a barely perceptible nod, his fingers sorting through the familiar landscape of social obligations and business matters with practiced efficiency. The Dowager Countess's charity events were among the few social functions he attended with any regularity, partly because they served genuinely worthy causes, and partly because her luncheons were mercifully brief and focused on purpose rather than matchmaking. "Send my acceptance," Philip said without looking up, "the usual donation, and ensure she understands I cannot stay beyond the scheduled program." "Very good, Your Grace," Hastings replied, though something in his tone suggested he had more to say. Philip glanced up with the mild irritation of a man unaccustomed to having his instructions questioned. "Was there something else, Hastings?" "Forgive me, Your Grace, but the Dowager Countess's invitation mentions that her niece will be attending from the countryside, a Miss Sophie Hartley, recently arrived in London to assist the Countess with her charitable endeavors. Perhaps, that is, it might be a pleasant change to meet someone new to society." The suggestion hung between them, delicate as spun glass. Hastings had been with the Ashford family since before Philip's marriage, had witnessed the brightness of those early years and the desolation that followed. If the old man was attempting to spark even the faintest interest in something beyond the gray fog of routine, it was born of genuine concern rather than presumption. "I'm sure she'll be perfectly adequate," Philip replied dismissively, returning his attention to the correspondence. "A niece is a niece, Hastings. One stranger is much like another." "Of course, Your Grace," Hastings agreed, though his tone suggested a quiet disagreement. "Will there be anything else this morning?" "No, that will be all." After Hastings withdrew, Philip found himself staring at the Dowager Countess's invitation with an attention it didn't warrant. The elegant script mentioned the delightful presence of my dear niece, Sophie Hartley, whose spirit has brought such joy to my home. The words meant nothing to him. Joy, delight, spirit, these were currencies that held no value in his carefully controlled existence. He had become an expert at the performance of presence without participation, at occupying space without truly inhabiting it. He could attend a luncheon, nod at appropriate intervals, contribute the requisite pleasantries, and depart without having felt a single genuine emotion. It was a skill he had honed to perfection, this ability to move through life as if through a particularly tedious play in which he had memorized all his lines but felt none of the sentiment behind them. Still, as he set the invitation aside and returned to his estate reports, he found his mind wandering to the upcoming luncheon in a way that surprised him. It had been months, perhaps years, since anything had penetrated the fog enough to register as even mild curiosity. The fact that a stranger's name could create even the smallest ripple in the flatness of his days was both intriguing and vaguely troubling. Perhaps Hastings was right. Perhaps a change, however minor, might be, not pleasant exactly, but at least different. And different, Philip had learned, was sometimes the closest thing to relief his carefully managed existence could provide. As the fog continued its silent siege against the windows of Ashford House, the Duke, who had forgotten how to smile, made a decision that would fracture the foundations of his carefully constructed world, though he could not yet know it. He would attend the Dowager Countess's luncheon, he would meet Miss Sophie Hartley with polite indifference, and he would continue the elaborate performance of living that had sustained him for 10 long years.
What he could not anticipate was that sometimes the most profound earthquakes begin with the smallest tremors, and a woman's laughter could reach places in the human heart that a decade of careful fortification had failed to protect. The Dowager Countess of Lennox's drawing room glowed with autumn sunlight on the day of the luncheon, light streaming through tall windows to illuminate the assembled company in shades of amber and gold. Philip arrived precisely 15 minutes after the stated time, early enough to demonstrate proper respect, late enough to avoid the awkwardness of preliminary small talk. He entered with the bearing of a man attending a military inspection rather than a social gathering, his posture impeccable, his expression pleasantly neutral. He took his usual position near the windows, close enough to participate when required, but positioned to observe rather than engage. From this vantage point, he could perform his social obligations with minimal actual interaction, acknowledging acquaintances with polite nods while maintaining the comfortable distance
that had become his default setting. "Your Grace," the Dowager Countess approached with the determined smile of a hostess who took personal pride in the attendance of every notable guest. "How wonderful to see you! I do hope you'll find today's gathering particularly engaging." "I'm certain it will be most worthwhile, Lady Lennox," Philip replied with the automatic courtesy that had served him well for a decade. "Your charitable initiatives are always impeccably organized." "You're too kind, Your Grace. Today I have a very special guest I'm eager for you to meet. My niece Sophie has been invaluable in organizing our new reading program for the parish children. She's recently arrived from Hampshire and has brought such wonderful energy to the project." Philip nodded politely, his attention already beginning to drift as Lady Lennox continued her enthusiastic description of the reading program. He had heard similar promises of wonderful energy and delightful company countless times before, each introduction carefully orchestrated by well-meaning society matrons who seemed convinced that the right young lady might somehow resurrect the Duke of Ashford's dormant heart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Lennox announced to the assembled company, "if you would be so kind as to take your seats, we shall begin with a brief presentation about our literacy initiative before proceeding to luncheon." As the guests settled into the arranged chairs, Philip found himself studying the small presentation area that had been created near the fireplace. A young woman stood there, her back to the audience as she organized papers and sample primers on a side table. From his position, he could see little more than her silhouette, a slender figure in a gown of warm russet that seemed to capture the autumn light, her chestnut hair arranged in a simple style that suggested practicality over fashion. "Miss Sophie Hartley will explain the details of our reading program," Lady Lennox announced, and the young woman turned to face her audience for the first time. Philip felt something shift in his chest, a sensation so unexpected that for a moment he wondered if he might be experiencing some form of physical distress. It wasn't pain exactly, but rather the sudden awareness of sensation in a place that had been numb for so long he'd forgotten it could feel anything at all. Miss Sophie Hartley was not beautiful in the way London society typically measured such things. Her features were too animated, her coloring too vibrant, her entire demeanor too undarted for the careful artifice that currently defined fashionable beauty. But there was something about her that commanded attention in a way that mere prettiness never could. Her face was expressive, intelligent, lit from within by a quality of genuine engagement with the world around her. Her hazel eyes, neither quite green nor quite brown, but something that shifted between the two depending on the light, held a warmth that seemed to encompass everyone in the room with equal sincerity. And when she smiled at the assembled company, a natural, unaffected expression of pleasure at the opportunity to share something she cared about, Philip felt his breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. This was what joy looked like. He had almost forgotten. "Good afternoon," Sophie said, her voice carrying a warmth that matched her expression.
I'm so grateful to my aunt for giving me the opportunity to work on this program, and I hope you'll all be as excited about it as I am." The simple words, spoken with such evident sincerity, created a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. This was not the usual performance of social obligation, with its carefully rehearsed talking points and strategic pauses for effect. This was genuine enthusiasm, unfiltered and unashamed. Philip found himself leaning forward slightly, his attention caught despite his determination to remain emotionally detached. When Sophie began describing the reading program, her entire demeanor transformed. She spoke with passion about the children she'd met, about the barriers to literacy in rural parishes, about the transformative power of stories and knowledge. She didn't lecture or condescend, but rather invited her audience into her vision, painting pictures with her words that made abstract statistics feel immediate and personal. There's a little girl named Emma who told me last week that she wants to read every book in the world. When I asked her why, she said, "Because then I'll know everything there is to know, and I can be anything I want to be." Sophie's smile was radiant as she continued, "That's why we're here today, because every child deserves the chance to know everything and be anything." Philip had sat through countless charity presentations over the years, had listened to numerous well-intentioned speeches about worthy causes with the patient endurance of a man fulfilling social obligations. But this was different. This was conviction delivered without pretension, passion communicated without performance. For the first time in 10 years, he was not merely listening, he was hearing, feeling, allowing himself to be moved by something beyond the boundaries of his carefully maintained emotional quarantine. When the presentation concluded, the drawing room filled with enthusiastic applause, but Philip barely registered it. He was staring at Sophie with an intensity he was only dimly aware of, studying her face as she acknowledged the audience's appreciation with the same natural grace she had shown throughout her presentation. There was no false modesty, no practiced humility, just genuine pleasure in having shared something meaningful. As the formal presentation concluded and guests began to circulate before luncheon, Philip found himself in an unusual predicament. His customary practice was to make a generous donation, exchange a few polite words with the organizers, and depart as soon as socially permissible. But today he felt an uncharacteristic reluctance to leave. More troubling still, he found himself wanting to speak with Miss Hartley, to tell her how her words had affected him, though he had no idea what he would say or how he could possibly explain the impact of his enthusiasm on his carefully guarded emotions. "Your Grace," the Dowager Countess's voice interrupted his internal debate, and he turned to find her approaching with Sophie at her side. "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to my niece. Miss Hartley, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Ashford. Your Grace, my niece, Miss Sophie Hartley." Philip found himself looking directly into Sophie's hazel eyes, and for a moment he forgot every polite phrase that should have accompanied such an introduction. Up close, she was even more striking than she had appeared from across the room, not because of conventional beauty, but because of an indefinable quality of presence, of being fully and completely alive in a way that seemed almost foreign to him. "Your Grace," Sophie said, with a curtsy that was perfectly proper but somehow managed to convey warmth rather than mere formality. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, as if she found something gently amusing about the whole ritual of titles and formal address. "Miss Hartley," Philip replied, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, rougher than usual, as if from disuse. "Your presentation was exceptional." The word felt inadequate, pale and bloodless compared to what he had actually experienced, but it was all he could manage without revealing more than he was prepared to share. Sophie's response was immediate and unguarded. "Thank you so much, Your Grace, though I suspect I may have been a bit too enthusiastic. My aunt keeps reminding me that passion is all very well, but brevity is a virtue.
She laughed, actually laughed at herself, the sound warm and musical and utterly without pretense. Philip felt that same unexpected shift in his chest, that sensation of something long dormant stirring reluctantly back toward awareness. When had anyone last laughed in his presence without it being carefully calibrated for effect? When had anyone shown him genuine emotion rather than the performance of emotion? Enthusiasm for a worthy cause is hardly a fault, Philip found himself saying. In fact, I would argue that most charitable endeavors suffer from too much detachment rather than too much passion. "That's very kind of you to say," Sophie replied, and Philip noticed that her eyes studied him with the same directness she had shown the entire room during her presentation. There was no calculation in her gaze, no assessment of rank or advantage, just genuine curiosity about the person before her. "Do you imagine that in your position you must encounter countless requests for charitable support? It must be difficult to know where to direct your generosity." The observation was surprisingly perceptive, acknowledging the complexity of his position without either flattery or resentment. Philip found himself oddly grateful for her directness. "It can be challenging," he admitted, then immediately wondered why he was sharing such thoughts with a woman he had just met. One learns to evaluate the sincerity of the cause rather than the eloquence of the presentation. "And does our reading program pass your evaluation?" And I promise I wasn't trying to be eloquent, I was just trying to be honest about why it matters. "Your honesty was precisely what made it compelling," Philip replied, and realized with some surprise that he meant it. Most presentations of this nature feel rehearsed. Yours felt real. Sophie's smile in response was radiant, and Philip felt something he had not experienced in a decade, the faint, almost forgotten impulse to return it. His facial muscles seemed to have forgotten the mechanics of smiling, holding his expression in its customary neutrality even as something inside him strained toward a response he could not quite produce. "You're very generous," Sophie said. "I wasn't certain if my approach was appropriate for London society. I tend to speak from the heart, which my aunt tells me can be a liability in polite company." Perhaps polite company could benefit from more honesty and less performance, Philip heard himself say, then immediately wondered at his own boldness. He did not typically share such opinions, particularly not with strangers at social gatherings. Before Sophie could respond, they were joined by several other guests eager to discuss the reading program and offer their support. As the conversation became more general, Philip found himself studying Sophie's interactions with others, noting how she managed to make each person feel heard and valued, how she accepted praise without false modesty, but also without arrogance, how she listened as intently as she spoke. "Your Grace," Lady Lennox said, drawing his attention back to the immediate conversation, "I was just telling Sophie about some of the other charitable initiatives in London that might benefit from her organizational talents. Perhaps you might recommend some societies that would welcome someone with her obvious dedication." Philip realized that Lady Lennox was attempting to facilitate further interaction between him and Sophie, hardly subtle, but delivered with enough grace to avoid being offensive. Under normal circumstances, he would have deflected such matchmaking with polite but firm discouragement. Today, however, he found himself genuinely considering the question. The Foundling Hospital is always in need of dedicated volunteers, and the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge does excellent work in education. Both would benefit from someone with your evident passion for literacy. "That sounds wonderful," Sophie said with obvious enthusiasm. "I would love to learn more about opportunities to help, though I must confess I'm still finding my way around London. Everything is so much larger and more complex than Hampshire."
"Perhaps," he heard himself saying before he could consider the wisdom of the offer, "you would allow me to provide an introduction to the directors of these organizations. I maintain relationships with both, and a personal recommendation might smooth the way for your involvement." The words hung in the air between them, and Philip felt a moment of something close to panic as he realized what he had just done. He had not volunteered his personal assistance to anyone in 10 years, had not offered his time or influence beyond the bare minimum required by social obligation and duty. What had possessed him to make such an offer to a woman he had known for less than an hour? "That's incredibly kind, Your Grace," Sophie replied, her eyes brightening with genuine pleasure. "I would be most grateful for any assistance. I'm passionate about the work, but I'll admit to being rather overwhelmed by London's social complexities." "It would be my pleasure," Philip assured her, though he was far from sure that was true. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own common sense was asking what he thought he was doing, breaking a decade's worth of careful routine for a woman whose only remarkable quality was that she seemed genuinely, unconsciously alive. "Shall we say Tuesday afternoon?" he continued, apparently unable to stop himself. "We could meet at the Foundling Hospital, and I could introduce you to the administrators there." "Tuesday would be perfect," Sophie agreed, her smile so warm and unaffected that Philip felt something crack in the careful armor he had worn for so long. "I look forward to it immensely."
As Philip took his leave shortly after luncheon, he had stayed longer than intended, but still departed before the gathering became too informal. He found himself in a state of confusion that was both deeply unsettling and oddly exhilarating. For 10 years, his life had followed a pattern so rigid it might have been carved in stone: duty, protocol, emotional distance, and the comfortable numbness of grief worn like a familiar coat. Today, in the space of a few hours, a woman's laugh had somehow penetrated defenses he had thought impregnable, and he had committed himself to a Tuesday meeting that represented a significant departure from his established routine. As his carriage made its way through the London streets toward Ashford House, Philip found himself thinking about what Sophie had said, about the little girl who wanted to read every book in the world so she could be anything she wanted to be. It was the kind of innocent optimism that should have felt foreign to him, that should have bounced off his cynicism like rain off slate. Instead, it had lodged somewhere in his chest, a small warm ember in a place that had been cold for so long. Perhaps most remarkably of all, as he reviewed correspondence in his study that evening, Philip caught his reflection in the darkened window and realized that his expression had softened in a way that he barely recognized. The lines around his mouth seemed less severe, the set of his jaw less rigid. For just a moment, looking at this stranger in the glass, he could almost imagine what he might look like if he smiled. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, and as he settled into his usual evening routine, dinner alone, a glass of port in the library, the grandfather clock marking the hours with relentless precision, Philip found himself anticipating Tuesday afternoon with an emotion that he was not yet ready to name, but that felt remarkably, impossibly, like hope. The days between Thursday's luncheon and Tuesday afternoon passed with unusual slowness for Philip, each hour marked by an anticipation that he was reluctant to acknowledge but unable to ignore. He found himself thinking about Sophie at odd moments, during his morning ride through Hyde Park, while reviewing correspondence, even during the tedious business of estate management that typically consumed his full attention. Her laughter seemed to echo in his memory, and more troubling still, he found himself wondering what she was doing, how she was spending her time in London, whether she was looking forward to Tuesday's meeting with anything approaching his own unexpected eagerness. On Monday, he visited his tailor, ostensibly to discuss adjustments to a waistcoat, but actually to ensure that his day wear was in impeccable condition. On Monday evening, he found himself reviewing information about the Foundling Hospital's programs with unusual attention, considering which aspects might most interest someone encountering London's charitable infrastructure for the first time.
Hastings, his butler, observed these subtle changes in routine with the careful attention of a man who had served the same master for 15 years. While he made no direct comment, Philip occasionally caught him looking thoughtful, as if witnessing something he had not expected to see again in his lifetime. "Your Grace," Hastings said as he assisted Philip with his preparations on Tuesday afternoon, "shall I have the carriage brought around at the usual time?" "Actually, we'll need to collect Miss Hartley from Lady Lennox's residence in Mayfair," Philip replied, attempting to keep his tone casual, as if this were a perfectly ordinary request. "I'll be escorting her to the Foundling Hospital." "Very good, Your Grace," Hastings replied, and Philip could have sworn he detected the faintest hint of satisfaction in the old man's voice. "Might I suggest taking the open barouche? The weather is quite fine, and the lady might enjoy seeing more of London during the journey." The suggestion caught Philip off guard. He had not thought about which carriage to use, had not considered the small courtesies that might make the afternoon more pleasant for Sophie. For a moment, he felt a flash of panic. What if he had forgotten other important details? What if his decade of emotional isolation had left him unprepared for the simple business of providing pleasant company? "Yes," he said finally, "the barouche would be appropriate." When the carriage arrived at Lady Lennox's elegant townhouse in Mayfair, Philip felt his pulse quicken in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of his youth. He had not experienced such nervousness about a social engagement since his courtship of Catherine, and the comparison brought with it a complex mixture of guilt and something he was not yet ready to examine too closely. Sophie emerged from the house before his footman could reach the door, suggesting she had been watching for his arrival. She was dressed in a walking dress of dove gray trimmed with burgundy ribbon, elegant but practical, fashionable but not ostentatious. As she approached the carriage, Philip found himself struck once again by her quality of aliveness, the way she seemed to bring light and energy to everything around her. "Your Grace," she said as he handed her into the barouche, "thank you so much for arranging this introduction. I've been looking forward to it all week." "As have I," Philip replied, then immediately wondered if such an admission was too revealing. The words had emerged without his permission, as if some part of him that had been silent for a decade had suddenly decided it deserved a voice. As their carriage made its way through Mayfair towards Bloomsbury, Philip found himself seeing London through Sophie's eyes, noting the elegant architecture of the squares, the bustling energy of the commercial streets, the stark contrasts between wealth and poverty that defined the city. Her observations were perceptive and thoughtful, never judgmental, but always engaged, always curious. "Oh my," Sophie said softly as they passed a street vendor, an elderly woman selling flowers from a basket, her clothes threadbare, but her posture proud. "She reminds me of Mrs. Cooper from our village. Same spirit, same refusal to be diminished by circumstance." Philip found himself looking at the flower seller with new attention, seeing not just another element of London's street life, but an individual with dignity and determination. It had been years since he had truly looked at anything, really seen it, rather than simply cataloging it as part of the familiar landscape. "Would you like to stop?" Philip heard himself ask. Sophie turned to him with surprise and pleasure. "Could we? I'd like to buy some of her flowers. They're lovely, and I imagine she doesn't get many carriage trade customers." Philip signaled to the driver, and within moments they were stopped beside the flower seller, a woman who looked up at the elegant barouche with a mixture of hope and wariness. "Your flowers are beautiful," Sophie said warmly, leaning forward in her seat. "Might I purchase a small bouquet?" The woman's face transformed with delight. "Oh, yes, miss. I've fresh violets and some late roses, picked this morning from the market gardens." As Sophie selected her flowers, chatting easily with the vendor about the best methods for keeping blooms fresh, Philip watched the exchange with something close to wonder. This was what kindness looked like, not the distant charity of aristocratic donation, but the genuine connection of one human being acknowledging another. When they resumed their journey, Sophie held the small bouquet of violets with obvious pleasure. "Thank you for stopping," she said to Philip. "I know it delayed us, but it seemed important somehow." "It was important," Philip replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Small kindnesses often are." Sophie studied him for a moment, her hazel eyes thoughtful. "You're not quite what I expected, Your Grace." "Oh?" Philip felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness. "And what did you expect?" "I'm not entirely sure," Amethyst admitted with characteristic honesty. "My aunt speaks of you with great respect, and London society seems to regard you with almost reverential awe. I suppose I expected someone more distant, more formidable."
"I assure you I can be quite formidable when the situation requires it," Philip said, and was rewarded with Sophie's laugh. "I don't doubt it for a moment," she replied, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "But there's a difference between being formidable by necessity and being unapproachable by nature. I suspect you are the former rather than the latter." The observation was far more perceptive than Philip was comfortable with, touching on truths he was not yet ready to examine. He found himself deflecting with a question of his own. "And what of you, Miss Hardley? Are you quite what London society expected?" Sophie laughed again, that warm, unguarded sound that seemed to bypass all of Philip's carefully constructed defenses. "I very much doubt London society has any expectations of me whatsoever. I'm merely Lady Lennox's country niece, here to assist with charitable endeavors before returning to my quiet life in Hampshire." "Merely?" Philip found himself questioning. "I would argue that someone who can command a room's attention and inspire genuine enthusiasm for literacy education is hardly merely anything." Sophie's cheeks colored slightly, the first time Philip had seen her show anything resembling self-consciousness. "You're very kind, Your Grace, though I suspect you're being generous in your assessment." "I'm rarely kind for its own sake," Philip replied, the words emerging with more honesty than he had intended. "And I'm even more rarely generous in my assessments of people. If I say your presentation was exceptional, you may trust that I mean it precisely." The conversation was interrupted by their arrival at the Foundling Hospital, its austere brick facade belying the important work conducted within. As Philip handed Sophie down from the carriage, he found himself reluctant to release her hand, as if breaking physical contact might somehow break the unexpected connection they had formed during the journey. "Oh my," Sophie breathed, looking up at the building with obvious emotion. "To think of all the children who have found hope and safety within these walls." Philip felt something shift in his chest again, that same sensation of awareness returning to long-numbed places. When had he last thought about the Foundling Hospital in terms of hope and safety, rather than simply as another charitable obligation? When had he last allowed himself to feel anything beyond detached approval for the institution's efficiency? As they entered the building and Philip made the promised introductions, he found himself watching Sophie's interactions with the administrators and children with a fascination that bordered on improper. She had the same quality here that she had shown at the luncheon, that ability to connect genuinely with every person she met, to make each individual feel seen and valued. When a small girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, approached Sophie shyly to show her a picture she had drawn, Philip saw Sophie drop to her knees, without regard for her elegant dress, meeting the child at eye level to admire the artwork with obvious sincerity. "This is beautiful," Sophie said warmly. "Is that your family?" The little girl nodded, her finger tracing the stick figures she had drawn. "That's me, and that's my brother, and that's our mama in heaven." Philip's throat tightened unexpectedly. For 10 years he had avoided children, had carefully arranged his life to minimize contact with anything that might remind him of what he and Catherine had lost. But watching Sophie with this child, seeing the genuine care and respect she showed for the girl's drawing and her story, he felt something that was not quite pain, but rather a kind of bittersweet recognition. This was what it meant to be present in life, rather than merely existing through it, to risk feeling, to allow oneself to be moved, to accept that connection required vulnerability. As their visit concluded and they returned to the carriage for the journey back to Mayfair, Philip found himself reluctant to end the afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the London sky in shades of amber and rose, and Sophie was quiet beside him, her expression thoughtful.
"Thank you," she said finally, turning to him with obvious sincerity. "Not just for the introduction, but for allowing me to see that side of London's charitable work. It's one thing to hear about such institutions, and quite another to see the real impact on real children." "It was my pleasure," Philip replied, and realized that he meant it in a way that surprised him. For the first time in 10 years, an afternoon had passed that he had not merely endured, but actually enjoyed. As they neared Lady Lennox's residence, Sophie turned to him with a slightly hesitant expression. "Your Grace, I hope this isn't too forward, but my aunt is hosting a small dinner party on Friday evening. Just a dozen or so guests, nothing grand. She asked me to extend an invitation to you if you would be interested in attending." Philip knew he should decline. His calendar was carefully managed to minimize social obligations, and intimate dinner parties were precisely the kind of event he typically avoided. Too much potential for personal conversation, too many opportunities to be drawn into situations that required emotional engagement. But looking at Sophie's hopeful expression, remembering the unexpected lightness he had felt during their afternoon together, Philip found himself responding in a way that defied a decade of careful habit. "I would be honored to attend," he said, and watched her face light up with a smile that made something in his chest ache in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. As Sophie departed with expressions of thanks and anticipation for Friday's dinner, Philip sat in his carriage for a long moment, feeling as though he were standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. For 10 years, he had lived in the gray fog of mourning, had worn his grief like armor against the painful brightness of life. But this afternoon, in the company of a woman whose only magic was her genuine, unguarded humanity, he had felt that fog beginning to thin. The grandfather clock would still tick in his library tonight, marking the hours with the same relentless precision it had maintained for a decade. But Philip suspected that something fundamental had shifted in the landscape of his existence, some small but significant movement from endurance towards engagement, from merely breathing to something that might eventually resemble living. And as his carriage returned to the silent grandeur of Ashford House, the Duke, who had not smiled in 10 years, caught his reflection in the carriage window and realized that his expression held something it had not contained in all that time. Not a smile, not yet, but the possibility of one, waiting just beneath the surface like the first crocus of spring beneath winter snow.
The morning ritual began, as it always did, with the precision of a military campaign. At precisely 6 o'clock, Hastings entered the Duke's bedchamber with a silver tray bearing tea, Earl Grey, no sugar, no milk, and the morning newspapers arranged in order of importance. At 6:30, Philip rose and dressed with the assistance of his valet, selecting from a wardrobe that consisted almost entirely of variations on the same theme: dark coats, somber waistcoats, cravats tied with impeccable but joyless precision. By 7, he was seated at the breakfast table, consuming his meal with the same mechanical efficiency he applied to all aspects of his existence. The household staff moved around him like planets orbiting a distant, cold sun, present, dutiful, but maintaining a careful distance. They had learned, over the course of a decade, that the Duke of Ashford preferred silence to conversation, efficiency to warmth, and above all, predictability to anything that might disrupt the carefully calibrated monotony of his days. After breakfast, Philip retreated to his study, that masculine sanctuary of leather and mahogany, where he conducted the business of managing one of England's largest fortunes with the same emotional detachment he brought to everything else. Estate reports, investment portfolios, correspondence with solicitors and land agents, all of it received his meticulous attention without engaging anything resembling genuine interest. He was, his man of business had once observed with grudging admiration, the most ruthlessly efficient Duke to England. What the man had not said, but what everyone understood, was that efficiency was often the refuge of those who could not be tolerated to feel. By mid-morning, Philip typically rode through Hyde Park, maintaining the physical fitness that society expected of a gentleman, while steadfastly avoiding the social aspects of the morning promenade. He rode early, when the paths were still relatively empty, choosing routes that minimized encounters with acquaintances. When confronted with the inevitable greetings, for a duke could not ride through London completely unacknowledged, he responded with polite nods and brief exchanges that conveyed respect without inviting prolonged conversation. The whispers followed him wherever he went, a constant undercurrent to his public appearances. "There's Ashford," they would say. 10 years and still in mourning, though he doesn't wear the armband anymore. They say he's never been seen to smile since the Duchess died. My cousin tried to interest him in her daughter last season. He was perfectly polite, perfectly correct, and about as warm as a January frost. The Tun had created a mythology around him, transforming his grief into something almost romantic. He was the tragic duke, the gentleman of perpetual sorrow, the man whose heart had died with his Duchess. Young ladies sighed over him at balls, imagining themselves as the one who might finally thaw his frozen heart. Their mothers regarded him with a mixture of ambition and frustration, recognizing both the prestige of the match and the impossibility of achieving it. Philip was aware of his reputation and largely indifferent to it. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Their romantic notions about his grief were infinitely preferable to the truth, that he had simply forgotten how to feel anything at all, that mourning had calcified into habit, and habit into the very structure of his identity. Afternoons brought social obligations that he could not entirely avoid. He attended sessions in the House of Lords with dutiful regularity, contributing to debates with thoughtful, well-reasoned arguments delivered in a tone of studied neutrality. He sat on the boards of various charitable institutions, donating generously and attending quarterly meetings with punctual reliability. He accepted invitations to dinners and balls in careful moderation, enough to maintain his position in society, but not so many as to suggest any genuine engagement with social life. At these events, he had perfected the art of being present without being available. He stood in ballrooms without dancing. He sat at dinner tables without truly conversing. He occupied space with such impeccable courtesy that no one could accuse him of rudeness, yet with such palpable distance that no one dared presume intimacy. He was, in essence, a ghost at his own life, visible, acknowledged, but fundamentally untouchable. The evenings were perhaps the most honest part of his day, for they required no performance. He dined alone in the vast dining room, served by silent footmen who had learned not to attempt conversation. He read in his library, though he retained little of what he absorbed, the words sliding through his consciousness without leaving any lasting impression. And always the grandfather clock marked the hours with its relentless rhythm, each tick a reminder that time was passing, even if life was not. Sometimes, late at night, Philip would stand at the window of his study and look out over the dark expanse of the gardens. In those moments, he occasionally wondered what it would feel like to want something, to anticipate tomorrow rather than simply endure it. But the wondering never lasted long. It was dangerous to allow such thoughts, dangerous to remember that there had once been a version of himself who had laughed easily, loved deeply, and approached each day with something resembling joy. That man had died with Catherine. What remained was a duke who fulfilled his obligations with exemplary precision, maintained his estates with impeccable efficiency, and moved through society with the cold grace of a man carved from marble. The Duke of Shadows, they called him in the more dramatic corners of the Tun. It was, Philip thought with grim satisfaction, an entirely appropriate title. For shadows were happened when light was blocked, and he had been standing in his own way for so long now that he had almost forgotten what sunshine felt like. The Dowager Countess's dinner party was precisely the sort of intimate gathering that Philip normally avoided with strategic precision. 12 guests, she had said, which meant actual conversation would be unavoidable. No large ballroom where one could fade into the periphery, no crush of attendees providing convenient camouflage for early departure. Just a carefully curated selection of intelligent, accomplished individuals seated around a table where silence would be conspicuous and participation expected.
Philip had arrived with a plan. Arrive precisely on time, engage in the minimum requisite conversation, plead an early morning obligation, and depart before the evening could demand anything approaching genuine engagement. It was a strategy that had served him well for years, a reliable formula for navigating social obligations without risking emotional exposure. The plan disintegrated the moment he entered Lady Lennox's drawing room and heard Sophie laugh. It wasn't a polite titter or a carefully modulated expression of amusement designed for social effect. It was a real laugh, full-throated and uninhibited, the kind of sound that seemed to fill the entire room with warmth. Philip felt it like a physical sensation, as if someone had thrown open windows in a house that had been shuttered for a decade, letting in air and light and all the uncomfortable vitality of the living world. Sophie stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a small group of guests, animated in her conversation about something that had clearly delighted her. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that brought out the shifting colors in her hazel eyes, and her chestnut hair was arranged with elegant simplicity. But it wasn't her appearance that arrested Philip's attention. It was her energy, that quality of being so fully present and engaged that she seemed to illuminate everything around her. "Your Grace," Lady Lennox materialized at his elbow with the triumphant smile of a hostess whose careful seating arrangements were about to bear fruit. "Come, you must join our conversation. We were just discussing the most absurd debate in Parliament about the regulation of street lighting." Before Philip could formulate a polite deflection, he found himself being guided toward the group near the fireplace, directly into Sophie's orbit. She turned as they approached, and her face lit up with a smile that was so genuinely pleased to see him that Philip felt something uncomfortably shift in his chest. "Your Grace," she said warmly, "what perfect timing. Perhaps you can settle our debate. Lord Pemberton insists that gas lighting will never replace oil lamps throughout London, while I maintain that progress is inevitable once the benefits become clear." Philip found himself studying her face, noting the way her eyes sparkled with intellectual engagement, the way her entire being seemed to lean into the conversation with unguarded enthusiasm. It's disorienting, this level of genuine animation. In his world, people modulated their responses, calculated their displays of emotion, performed interest rather than actually feeling it. "I would argue," Philip heard himself saying, "that Miss Hartley has the right of it. Progress may be resisted, but it's rarely stopped entirely. The question is not whether gaslighting will prevail, but how long it will take for practicality to overcome tradition." Sophie's smile broadened, and Philip felt an unexpected warmth at having pleased her. "You see," she said to Lord Pemberton with playful triumph, "even a duke can recognize that sometimes the old ways must make room for the new." The comment hung in the air for a moment, innocent enough on the surface, but Philip caught the flicker of concern that crossed Sophie's face as she realized the potential double meaning of her words. In a room full of people who knew his history, any reference to old ways making room for the new could be interpreted as commentary on his 10 years of mourning. But instead of offense or withdrawal that Sophie clearly feared, Philip felt something unexpected: amusement.
She hadn't meant it as criticism, hadn't been making some pointed observation about his life. She had simply been engaged in an honest debate, speaking her mind without the careful calculation that characterized most of his social interactions. "Sometimes," Philip said quietly, meeting her eyes, "the difficulty is not in recognizing that change is necessary, but in remembering how to implement it." The words carried more weight than the conversation warranted, and Philip saw understanding flicker in Sophie's gaze. Not pity, thank God, but something closer to recognition, as if she understood both what he had said and what he had left unspoken. Their exchange was interrupted by the announcement of dinner, and Philip found himself unsurprised to discover that Lady Lennox had seated him directly beside Sophie. The manipulation was hardly subtle, but he found he didn't particularly mind. If he had to endure an evening of conversation, at least Sophie's company promised to be genuine rather than performed.
As they took their seats and the first course was served, Philip discovered that conversing with Sophie was like standing too close to a fire, simultaneously uncomfortable and impossible to step away from. She asked questions with genuine curiosity, listened to her answers with evident interest, and offered her own observations with a directness that was both refreshing and unnerving. "Tell me," she said as they navigated through the fish course, "what do you do when you're not managing estates and attending charitable board meetings? Surely there must be something that brings you joy, rather than merely occupying your time." The question was so unexpectedly direct that Philip felt momentarily disarmed. When had anyone last asked him about joy? When had he last considered whether any activity in his life qualified as something more than mere occupation? "I read," he said finally, aware of how inadequate the answer sounded. "History, primarily. Philosophy, occasionally." "But do you enjoy it?" Sophie pressed gently. "Or is it simply another way to fill the hours?" Philip found himself caught between irritation at her persistence and surprise at her perceptiveness. "Does it matter?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. "Not everything in life need be enjoyed, Miss Hartley. Some things are simply done." Instead of retreating at his curtness, Sophie tilted her head thoughtfully. "I suppose that's true," she said, "but it seems a rather gray way to live, doesn't it? Moving through days without ever stopping to notice what makes them worthwhile." "Perhaps some of us have learned that noticing too much leads only to disappointment," Philip replied, then immediately regretted the admission. He did not share such thoughts, particularly not with relative strangers at dinner parties. But Sophie didn't pounce on his words or offer platitudes about finding joy again. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. "I can understand that," she said quietly, "though I wonder if the solution to disappointment is to stop noticing entirely or to learn to notice differently." Before Philip could respond, before he could even fully process what she had said, Lady Lennox engaged Sophie in conversation about the literacy program, and the moment passed. But throughout the remainder of dinner, through course after course of excellent food that Philip barely tasted, he found himself hyper-aware of Sophie's presence beside him. Her laugh, when it came, seemed to ring through him like a bell. Her voice, animated in conversation with other guests, drew his attention even when he tried to focus elsewhere. It was exhausting, this level of awareness. For years, he had moved through social gatherings in a state of pleasant numbness, present but not truly engaged, participating but not truly connecting. Sophie's proximity shattered that comfortable distance, forcing him to be present in a way that felt simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to take their leave, Philip found Sophie had somehow maneuvered beside him in the entrance hall. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said, her voice pitched low beneath the general murmur of departing guests. "I know intimate dinners aren't your preferred entertainment." "What makes you think that?" Philip asked, though he was impressed by her observation. Sophie's smile was gentle, knowing. "Because you've been counting the courses all evening, calculating how soon you could politely escape. But you stayed anyway, which I choose to interpret as a kindness." Philip felt himself caught between denial and admiration for her directness. "Perhaps I simply enjoyed the company more than expected," he said, surprised by his own honesty. "Then perhaps," Sophie replied, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope, "you might consider accepting invitations more often. The world has a way of being less gray when you let yourself notice it." As Philip's carriage carried him home through the London night, he found himself thinking about light, how it could be gentle or harsh, welcomed or painful. For 10 years he had lived in carefully maintained shadow, and Sophie was the kind of bright, unfiltered sunlight that revealed every cobweb, every accumulation of dust and neglect. It should have been unwelcome, this intrusion of light into his carefully curated gloom. Instead, Philip found himself wondering what else might become visible if he allowed himself to truly see again. Chapter 3. The Unbidden Memory. Philip had not intended to encounter Sophie again so soon. He had, in fact, spent the 3 days following Lady Lennox's dinner party carefully avoiding situations where such an encounter might occur. He declined 2 invitations where he suspected she might be present, altered his writing schedule to avoid the fashionable hours in Hyde Park, and generally retreated into the comfortable routines that had sustained him for a decade. It was particularly unfortunate that he quite literally collided with her outside Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly. He had been exiting the establishment, his attention focused on a newly acquired volume of Roman history, when a sudden gust of autumn wind sent several loose pages skittering across the pavement. Without thinking, Philip moved to retrieve them, stepping directly into the path of a young woman carrying an armful of books so precarious that the collisions sent them cascading to the ground in a flurry of leather bindings and fluttering pages. "Oh!" Sophie's voice registered moments before Philip fully recognized her. "Your Grace?" Philip found himself on his knees on the pavement of Piccadilly, surrounded by scattered books, staring up at Sophie's surprised face. For a moment, the sheer absurdity of the situation held him motionless. The Duke of Ashford, kneeling in the street like a common errand boy, his carefully maintained dignity compromised by a gust of wind and an armful of books. He should have been mortified. Instead, he felt something dangerously close to amusement. "Miss Hartley," Philip said, rising to his feet and beginning to gather the scattered volumes, "it appears we've created quite a spectacle." Sophie laughed, that same uninhibited sound that had arrested his attention at the dinner party, and knelt beside him to help collect her books. "I do have a talent for making dramatic entrances, though I prefer them to be intentional. Are you hurt?" "Only my dignity," Philip replied, and was rewarded with another laugh that seemed to warm something inside his chest that had been cold for too long. As they gathered the scattered books, Philip noticed the titles, a mix of poetry, philosophy, and agricultural treatises that suggested an eclectic and curious mind. One slim volume had fallen open to reveal a pressed flower between its pages, a delicate wildflower that must have been carefully preserved. "You press flowers," Philip observed, the words emerging before he could consider whether such a personal observation was appropriate. Sophie's cheeks colored slightly as she reached for the book. "I know it's terribly sentimental, but I can't help myself. When I find something beautiful, I want to preserve it somehow. That one is from a meadow near our home in Hampshire. The light there in early morning is quite extraordinary, everything covered in dew and catching the sunrise like tiny prisms."
The way she spoke with such genuine enthusiasm for something as simple as morning light in a meadow triggered something in Philip's memory. Catherine had loved mornings too, had often risen early to walk in their gardens, returning with her hands full of flowers and her face bright with the simple pleasure of witnessing a new day. He had sometimes joined her, in those early years of their marriage, standing beside her in companionable silence as the world woke around them. The memory arrived unbidden and unwelcome, sharp with a clarity he had not experienced in years. He could almost smell the roses, could almost hear Catherine's soft exclamation of delight at finding a particularly perfect bloom. For a decade, he had kept such memories at bay, had refused to let them surface, because allowing himself to remember the joy made the loss unbearable. But standing on a London street with Sophie, books scattered around them and that pressed flower trembling slightly in the breeze, Philip felt the memory wash over him not with the usual suffocating pain, but with something closer to bittersweet recognition. Catherine had loved beautiful things. She had pressed flowers too, had filled their home with small tokens of the natural world she cherished. She had been alive in the way Sophie was alive, fully present, genuinely engaged, unafraid to delight in simple pleasures. "Your Grace?" Sophie's voice broke through his reverie, concerned. "Are you quite all right? You look rather pale." Philip realized he had been standing motionless, staring at the pressed flower with an intensity that must have alarmed her. He forced himself to focus, to return to the present moment, even as part of his mind remained trapped in that sunlit garden of memory. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Your flower reminded me of someone. That is, my late wife also pressed flowers. I had forgotten." The words hung between them, and Philip braced himself for the inevitable expression of pity, the carefully modulated sympathy that always accompanied any mention of Catherine. But Sophie simply nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. "I'm glad you remembered,"
she said quietly. Beautiful memories shouldn't be forgotten, even when they hurt. Perhaps especially when they hurt, because the hurt means the beauty was real. The observation was so unexpected, so perfectly calibrated between acknowledgement and understanding without crossing into unwanted sympathy, that Philip felt something crack in the careful armor he had worn for so long. This was what he had been avoiding, this recognition that allowing himself to remember the good meant feeling the loss all over again. But Sophie's words suggested something he had not considered, that perhaps the loss was worth feeling if it meant the beauty could be preserved rather than buried. They finished gathering the books in silence, and Philip insisted on carrying them to Sophie's waiting carriage despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of managing herself. As they walked the short distance, Philip found himself hyper-aware of the life moving around them, merchants calling their wares, carriages rattling past, the smell of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor. When had he stopped noticing these things? When had the world become simply a stage set through which he moved without truly seeing? "Thank you," Sophie said as they reached her carriage and he handed her the stack of books, "for helping with these and for sharing that memory. I know it must have been difficult." "Difficult," Philip repeated, testing the word. It wasn't quite right, but he didn't have language for what he had actually felt. That strange mixture of pain and something that might have been gratitude, the uncomfortable sensation of feeling anything at all after years of careful numbness. But perhaps the loss was worth feeling if it meant the beauty could be preserved rather than buried. They finished gathering the books in silence, and Philip insisted on carrying them to Sophie's waiting carriage despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of managing herself. As they walked the short distance, Philip found himself hyper-aware of the life moving around them, merchants calling their wares, carriages rattling past, the smell of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor. When had he stopped noticing these things? When had the world become simply a stage set through which he moved without truly seeing? "Thank you," Sophie said as they reached her carriage and he handed her the stack of books, "for helping with these and for sharing that memory. I know it must have been difficult." "Difficult," Philip repeated, testing the word. It wasn't quite right, but he didn't have language for what he had actually felt. That strange mixture of pain and something that might have been gratitude, the uncomfortable sensation of feeling anything at all after years of careful numbness. Philip told himself he was calling on Lady Lennox to discuss the Foundling Hospital's expansion plans. It was a perfectly reasonable excuse. He was, after all, a patron of the institution, and Lady Lennox served on the auxiliary committee. The fact that Sophie was residing with her aunt was entirely incidental to his visit, merely a coincidence that he had chosen this particular Tuesday afternoon when he knew from their previous conversation that Sophie would be helping her aunt review applications for the literacy program. Hastings had said nothing when Philip ordered the carriage prepared for an unscheduled social call, but the butler's carefully neutral expression spoke volumes. In 10 years, Philip had never once made an impromptu visit to anyone. His social calendar was managed with the precision of a military campaign, every engagement planned weeks in advance, every interaction carefully controlled. "Shall I send word ahead, Your Grace?" Hastings had asked, holding out the silver salver for calling cards. "No. That is, this is merely an informal matter. No need for ceremony." Now, standing in Lady Lennox's elegant drawing room while a footman went to announce his arrival, Philip felt the first stirrings of uncertainty. What was he doing here? What possible excuse could justify this breach of protocol, this spontaneous call that violated every social norm he had maintained for a decade? "Your Grace!" Lady Lennox swept into the room with evident pleasure. "What a delightful surprise! Sophie and I were just reviewing the most encouraging applications for our reading program. You must join us. Your perspective would be invaluable." Before Philip could formulate a response that would allow him to retreat with dignity and tact, Sophie appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple day dress of pale lavender, and her hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had been running her fingers through it while concentrating on paperwork. She looked surprised to see me, but pleased, genuinely pleased, without calculation or artifice. "Your Grace," she said warmly, "this is unexpected. I hope nothing is wrong with the Foundling Hospital." Philip seized on the offered excuse like a drowning man grasping a rope. Not at all. I simply wanted to discuss the expansion plans with Lady Lennox. I should have sent word ahead, but the matter only occurred to me this morning. It was a transparent lie, and from the knowing look in Lady Lennox's eyes, she recognized it as such, but she played along with admirable grace. How thoughtful of you, Your Grace, though the details of construction and funding are rather beyond my expertise. Sophie, however, has been helping me organize our approach to the auxiliary committee. Perhaps the two of you might discuss the particulars while I attend to some correspondence that simply cannot wait. The manipulation was so obvious it would have been insulting if Philip had not been grateful for it. Within moments, Philip found himself alone with Sophie in the drawing room, seated in chairs angled towards each other near the windows, with a tea service that had materialized with suspicious efficiency. "You didn't come here to discuss expansion plans," Sophie said without preamble, pouring tea with easy competence. "Not that I'm complaining, but I prefer honesty when possible. It makes conversations so much simpler." Philip felt heat rise to his face, an unfamiliar sensation after years of maintaining perfect aristocratic composure. "No," he admitted, surprising himself with the truthfulness. "I came to apologize for my behavior outside Hatchard's. I was abrupt, and I fear I made you uncomfortable with my personal revelations." Sophie handed him a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying. "I'm glad you remembered. Beautiful memories shouldn't be forgotten, even when they hurt. Perhaps especially when they hurt, because the hurt means the beauty was real." The observation was so unexpected, so perfectly calibrated between acknowledgement and understanding without crossing into unwanted sympathy, that Philip felt something crack in the careful armor he had worn for so long. This was what he had been avoiding, this recognition that allowing himself to remember the good meant feeling the loss all over again. But Sophie's words suggested something he had not considered, that perhaps the loss was worth feeling if it meant the beauty could be preserved rather than buried. They finished gathering the books in silence, and Philip insisted on carrying them to Sophie's waiting carriage, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of managing herself. As they walked the short distance, Philip found himself hyper-aware of the life moving around them, merchants calling their wares, carriages rattling past, the smell of roasting chestnuts from a street vendor. When had he stopped noticing these things? When had the world become simply a stage set through which he moved without truly seeing? "Thank you," Sophie said as they reached her carriage and he handed her the stack of books, "for helping with these and for sharing that memory. I know it must have been difficult." "Difficult," Philip repeated, testing the word. It wasn't quite right, but he didn't have language for what he had actually felt. That strange mixture of pain and something that might have been gratitude. The uncomfortable sensation of feeling anything at all after years of careful numbness. Philip told himself he was calling on Lady Lennox to discuss the Foundling Hospital's expansion plans. It was a perfectly reasonable excuse. He was, after all, a patron of the institution, and Lady Lennox served on the auxiliary committee. The fact that Sophie was residing with her aunt was entirely incidental to his visit. Merely a coincidence that he had chosen
this particular Tuesday afternoon, when he knew from their previous conversation that Sophie would be helping her aunt review applications for the literacy program. Hastings had said nothing when Philip ordered the carriage prepared for an unscheduled social call, but the butler's carefully neutral expression spoke volumes. In 10 years, Philip had never once made an impromptu visit to anyone. His social calendar was managed with the precision of a military campaign, every engagement planned weeks in advance, every interaction carefully controlled. "Shall I send word ahead, Your Grace?" Hastings had asked, holding out the silver salver for calling cards. "No," Philip had replied, then caught himself. This is merely an informal matter, no need for ceremony." Now, standing in Lady Lennox's elegant drawing room while a footman went to announce his arrival, Philip felt the first stirrings of uncertainty. What was he doing here? What possible excuse could justify this breach of protocol, this spontaneous call that violated every social norm he had maintained for a decade? "Your Grace," Lady Lennox swept into the room with evident pleasure. "What a delightful surprise. Sophie and I were just reviewing the most encouraging applications for our reading program. You must join us. Your perspective would be invaluable." Before Philip could formulate a response that would allow him to retreat with dignity and tact, Sophie appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple day dress of pale lavender, and her hair was slightly disheveled, as if she had been running her fingers through it while concentrating on paperwork. She looked surprised to see him, but pleased, genuinely pleased, without calculation or artifice. "Your Grace," she said warmly, "this is unexpected. I hope nothing is wrong with the Foundling Hospital." "Not at all. I simply wanted to discuss the expansion plans with Lady Lennox. I should have sent word ahead, but the matter only occurred to me this morning." It was a transparent lie, and from the knowing look in Lady Lennox's eyes, she recognized it as such, but she played along with admirable grace. "How thoughtful of you, Your Grace. Though I confess the details of construction and funding are rather beyond my expertise. Sophie, however, has been helping me organize our approach to the Auxiliary Committee. Perhaps the two of you might discuss the particulars while I attend to some correspondence that simply cannot wait." The manipulation was so obvious it would have been insulting if Philip hadn't been grateful for it. Within moments, Philip found himself alone with Sophie in the drawing room, seated in chairs angled toward each other near the windows, with a tea service that had materialized with suspicious efficiency. "You didn't come here to discuss expansion plans," Sophie said without preamble, pouring tea with easy competence. "Not that I'm complaining, but I prefer honesty when possible. It makes conversations so much simpler." Philip felt heat rise to his face, an unfamiliar sensation after years of maintaining perfect aristocratic composure. "No," he admitted, surprising himself with the truthfulness. "I came to apologize for my behavior outside Hatchards. I was abrupt, and I fear I made you uncomfortable with my personal revelations." Sophie handed him a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "You weren't abrupt, and you didn't make me uncomfortable. You were honest, which I found rather refreshing, though I suspect that's not really why you're here either." "No?" Philip asked, simultaneously intrigued and unnerved by her perceptiveness. "No," Sophie confirmed, settling back in her chair with her own cup. "I think you're here because our conversation troubled you, and you wanted to understand why. Or perhaps because you discovered that talking about difficult things was less terrible than you expected, and you're curious whether that was a momentary anomaly or something that might happen again." The accuracy of her assessment left Philip momentarily speechless. When had anyone last understood him so clearly? When had he last allowed anyone close enough to even attempt such understanding? "You're remarkably direct, Miss Hardley," he said finally. "I know," Sophie replied with a smile that held no apology. "It's one of my more troublesome qualities, according to my aunt. But I've found that life is too short for elaborate pretense. We spend so much time dancing around what we actually mean that we often forget to say anything meaningful at all." Philip found himself relaxing despite, or perhaps because of her candor. "And what do you think I mean coming here today?" Sophie considered the question seriously, tilting her head in that characteristic gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I think you mean that you're tired of being alone in your thoughts, that you've spent 10 years talking to yourself in an empty house, and you've discovered that you miss the unpredictability of real conversation, the kind where you don't already know what the other person will say." The accuracy of her assessment left Philip momentarily speechless. When had anyone last understood him so clearly? When had he last allowed anyone close enough to even attempt such understanding? "You're remarkably direct, Miss Hardley," he said finally. "I know," Sophie replied with a smile that held no apology. "It's one of my more troublesome qualities, according to my aunt. But I've found that life is too short for elaborate pretense. We spend so much time dancing around what we actually mean that we often forget to say anything meaningful at all." Philip found himself relaxing despite, or perhaps because of her candor. "And what do you think I mean coming here today?" Sophie considered the question seriously, tilting her head in that characteristic gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I think you mean that you're tired of being alone in your thoughts, that you've spent 10 years talking to yourself in an empty house, and you've discovered that you miss the unpredictability of real conversation, the kind where you don't already know what the other person will say." The accuracy of her assessment left Philip momentarily speechless.
When had anyone last understood him so clearly? When had he last allowed anyone close enough to even attempt such understanding? "You're remarkably direct, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "I know," Sophie replied with a smile that held no apology. "It's one of my more troublesome qualities, according to my aunt, but I've found that life is too short for elaborate pretense. We spend so much time dancing around what we actually mean that we often forget to say anything meaningful at all." Philip found himself relaxing despite, or perhaps because, of her candor. "And what do you think I mean coming here today?" Sophie considered the question seriously, tilting her head in that characteristic gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I think you mean that you're tired of being alone in your thoughts, that you've spent 10 years talking to yourself in an empty house, and you've discovered that you miss the unpredictability of real conversation, the kind where you don't already know what the other person will say." The accuracy of her assessment left Philip momentarily speechless. When had anyone last understood him so clearly? When had he last allowed anyone close enough to even attempt such understanding? "You're remarkably direct, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "I know," Sophie replied with a smile that held no apology. "It's one of my more troublesome qualities, according to my aunt, but I've found that life is too short for elaborate pretense. We spend so much time dancing around what we actually mean that we often forget to say anything meaningful at all." Philip found himself relaxing despite, or perhaps because, of her candor. "And what do you think I mean coming here today?" Sophie considered the question seriously, tilting her head in that characteristic gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I think you mean that you're tired of being alone in your thoughts, that you've spent 10 years talking to yourself in an empty house, and you've discovered that you miss the unpredictability of real conversation, the kind where you don't already know what the other person will say." The accuracy of her assessment left Philip momentarily speechless. When had anyone last understood him so clearly? When had he last allowed anyone close enough to even attempt such understanding? "You're remarkably direct, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "I know," Sophie replied with a smile that held no apology. "It's one of my more troublesome qualities, according to my aunt, but I've found that life is too short for elaborate pretense. We spend so much time dancing around what we actually mean that we often forget to say anything meaningful at all." Philip found himself relaxing despite, or perhaps because, of her candor. "And what do you think I mean coming here today?" Sophie considered the question seriously, tilting her head in that characteristic gesture he was beginning to recognize. "I think you mean that you're tired of being alone in your thoughts, that you've spent 10 years talking to yourself in an empty house, and you've discovered that you miss the unpredictability of real conversation, the kind where you don't already know what the other person will say." The observation struck too close to truth for comfort. Philip set down his teacup, needing something to do with his hands. "I'm not certain I'm ready for unpredictability." "No one ever is," Sophie said gently. "That's rather the point of unpredictability. If we were ready for it, it wouldn't be unpredictable anymore." Despite himself, Philip felt his mouth quirk, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the muscle memory of amusement. "You have an answer for everything, don't you?" "Not at all," Sophie laughed. "I simply have a great many opinions and very little filter to prevent me from sharing them. It's quite different from actually having answers." They fell into conversation then, easier and more natural than Philip could have anticipated. Sophie asked him about his estates, and instead of offering the usual bland generalities, he found himself describing the challenges of modernizing agricultural practices while maintaining traditional tenant relationships. She listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated she understood both the practical and human elements of estate management. In turn, he asked about her life in Hampshire, and she painted vivid pictures of village life, the petty dramas, the small kindnesses, the way a community knit itself together through shared joys and sorrows. She spoke of teaching reading to children in the village school, of helping her father manage their modest estate, of the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, even if it wasn't grand.
Time passed in a way Philip had almost forgotten was possible, not marked by the relentless ticking of a clock or the dutiful progression through scheduled obligations, but flowing naturally from one topic to the next, shaped by genuine interest rather than social necessity. He told her about a tenant farmer who had developed an innovative crop rotation system. She described a student who had struggled with reading until Sophie discovered the child needed spectacles. He mentioned his frustration with Parliament's resistance to factory reform. She shared her concerns about the growing divide between rural and urban poor. They debated, agreed, disagreed, actually laughed at shared observations about London's more absurd social conventions. And through it all, Philip felt something he had not experienced in a decade, the simple, profound pleasure of genuine human connection. The crack in his armor had widened, and instead of the expected pain, he felt something that might have been relief. Perhaps, he thought, isolation had protected him from pain, but it had also separated him from everything that made pain worth risking in the first place. Chapter 5. A Dance with the Present. The Marchioness of Pemberton's Autumn Ball was the kind of event Philip had perfected the art of enduring: arrive at an acceptable hour, maintain a position of polite visibility without actual engagement, depart before the evening descended into the more frivolous entertainments. He had not danced in 10 years. He had not, in fact, stepped onto a ballroom floor for anything beyond the most minimal social obligations required of his rank. Tonight, he broke that carefully maintained pattern within 15 minutes of arrival. Sophie stood near the terrace doors, partially hidden behind a potted palm, looking simultaneously enchanted and overwhelmed by the spectacle of London society in full display. She wore a deep emerald gown that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that somehow still managed to look natural rather than contrived. But it was her expression that caught his attention, that mixture of wonder and wariness, as if she were watching a fascinating but potentially dangerous performance. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Sophie's face lit with such genuine pleasure at seeing him that Philip felt something shift in his chest. Without thinking, without planning, without the careful calculation that had governed his every social interaction for a decade, he crossed the room towards her. The whispers began immediately. He could feel them rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, the Duke of Ashford moving with purpose towards a young woman, actually seeking out company rather than enduring it. By the time he reached Sophie, he was sure every matron in the room was watching with barely concealed fascination. "Your Grace," Sophie said, offering a bow that was perhaps slightly more necessary than strictly necessary. "Miss Hartley," he said, offering a bow that was perhaps slightly deeper than strictly necessary. "You look as though you're contemplating escape." Sophie's laugh was quiet but genuine. "Is it that obvious? I'm afraid I'm not quite prepared for the intensity of London's social season. Everyone seems to be performing some elaborate dance I haven't learned the steps to." "Then perhaps I would allow you to teach me a simpler dance. The waltz is about to begin, and I find I'm quite tired of standing on the periphery." Sophie's eyes widened with surprise. "Your Grace, I don't want to presume. That is, I know you don't usually dance, and I wouldn't want to create any awkwardness." "The awkwardness exists whether we dance or not," Philip replied, surprising himself with his candor. "The tongue is already whispering about the fact that I crossed a ballroom to speak with you. We might as well give them something worth discussing." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sophie placed it in his. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Not an unpleasant one, but startling in its immediacy. How long had it been since he had touched another person with anything resembling genuine intent? As they moved onto the floor, Philip felt the weight of 100 stares, heard the sudden hush in conversation, followed by the inevitable rush of speculation. The Duke of Ashford, dancing, with a virtual nobody from Hampshire, after 10 years of refusing every debutante and widow in London. He should have cared. For a decade, he had been hyper-aware of society scrutiny, had carefully managed his reputation as the tragic Duke with the precision of a military campaign. But standing with Sophie in the opening position of the waltz, feeling her hand light in his, seeing the mixture of nervousness and trust in her eyes, Philip felt the whispers mean remarkably little.
"I should warn you," Sophie said quietly as the music began. "I'm competent at country dances, but the waltz is still rather new to me. If I step on your feet, please know it's inexperience rather than malice." "I suspect I'll survive," Philip replied, and began to lead her through the steps. She had understated her ability. Sophie danced with natural grace, following his lead with an ease that suggested she felt music instinctively rather than counting steps mechanically. But more than her technical skill, it was her complete presence that arrested him, the way she seemed entirely focused on the moment rather than the performance of it, the way her smile flickered and bloomed not for the audience, but simply from the pleasure of movement and music. "You're staring," Sophie observed, amusement coloring her voice.
I am observing, Philip corrected. There's a difference. And what are you observing? That you're the only person in this ballroom who appears to be genuinely enjoying herself, rather than calculating social advantage. Sophie's expression grew thoughtful as they turned through the figures. Perhaps that's because I have no social advantage to calculate. I'm nobody of particular importance, which means I'm free to simply experience things rather than worrying about what they mean. You're not nobody, Philip found himself saying, with more intensity than he intended. You're someone who remembers how to be present in her own life. That's considerably rarer than you might think. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that extended far beyond the ballroom. Sophie's eyes searched his face, and Philip had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, not as the Duke of Ashford, not as the tragic widower, but as Philip, a man who had forgotten how to be present and was only now beginning to remember. You could learn it again, Sophie said softly. Being present, it's not a skill that's lost forever, just one that requires practice. Is that what this is? Philip asked, turning her through another sequence. Practice? No, Sophie replied, her smile both gentle and knowing. This is just a dance, but it's also a choice, to step onto the floor despite the whispers, to move through the present moment rather than standing frozen in the past, to risk being seen doing something that brings you even the smallest measure of pleasure. The music swelled around them, and Philip found himself lost in the moment, the warmth of Sophie's hand in his, the subtle scent of lavender that surrounded her, the way the candlelight caught in her eyes. For 10 years he had been a statue, carefully positioned and utterly immobile. Now, moving through the patterns of the waltz, he felt something in that stone beginning to crack, to shift, to remember what it meant to be flesh and blood, rather than marble memorial. As the music drew to a close, Philip became aware of the ballroom again, the watching eyes, the suspended conversations, the weight of expectation and speculation. He should have released Sophie immediately, should have escorted her back to the safety of the wallflowers and retreated to his customary isolation. Instead, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "That was the first dance I've enjoyed in longer than I care to remember." "Then perhaps," Sophie replied, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope, "you might consider enjoying another sometime. Not tonight. I suspect we've provided quite enough entertainment for the gossips already. But sometime soon?" Philip felt his mouth quirk, not quite a smile, but closer than anything his face had managed in a decade. "I would like that, Miss Hartley, very much." As he escorted her from the floor, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them like a wake, Philip felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself. For 10 years, he had believed that protecting himself from pain meant avoiding all pleasure, that honoring Catherine's memory required preserving his grief like a sacred relic. But dancing with Sophie, moving through the present moment rather than standing paralyzed in the past, he had discovered something that both terrified and exhilarated him, that perhaps the truest way to honor what he had lost was to remember how to live again, that perhaps love was not a finite resource, but rather a muscle that atrophied from disuse. The emotional wall he had built so carefully was crumbling, and instead of the expected devastation, Philip felt something that might have been liberation.
The whispers of the ton meant nothing compared to the simple, profound truth Sophie had shown him, that being present in life required courage, but that the alternative was merely existing in an elaborate mausoleum of one's own construction. He had been a ghost for 10 years. Tonight, for the span of one waltz, he had remembered what it felt like to be alive, and the sensation, terrifying as it was, felt remarkably like coming home. Philip woke the morning after the ball with the uncomfortable sensation that he had betrayed something sacred. The feeling settled over him like a familiar weight, pressing down on his chest until breathing required conscious effort. He lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, trying to identify the precise moment when pleasure had transformed into guilt. It had been sometime during the night, in that hazy space between waking and sleeping, when his unconscious mind had conjured Catherine's face. Not the pale, illness-ravaged features of her final days, but Catherine as she had been in their early years together, laughing, vibrant, alive. In the dream, she had been standing in their garden, and he had been dancing with someone else. When he looked down, Sophie's emerald gown had transformed into Catherine's wedding dress, and he had woken with his heart pounding and the metallic taste of shame in his mouth. He had danced. He had enjoyed it, and for the span of that waltz, he had not thought of Catherine once. The realization hit him like a physical blow. 10 years of carefully maintained mourning, 10 years of ensuring that every thought, every action, every breath was filtered through the lens of loss, and he had forgotten her for the length of a dance. Worse, he had wanted to forget. In Sophie's company, he had wanted to be simply Philip rather than Catherine's bereaved husband, had wanted to exist in the present rather than the past. And that, he thought with growing horror, was the ultimate betrayal. By the time Hastings arrived with the morning tea, Philip had made his decision. He dressed with particular care, ensuring that his cravat was tied with austere precision, that his coat was the deepest black in his wardrobe, that every aspect of his appearance reinforced what he had almost allowed himself to forget. He was a man in mourning, and mourning required constancy. "Shall I have the carriage prepared, Your Grace?" Hastings asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I believe Miss Hartley mentioned yesterday that she would be visiting the Foundling Hospital this morning." The fact that Hastings knew this, that he was gently reminding Philip of Sophie's schedule, spoke volumes about how transparent Philip's recent behavior had been. For a moment, he felt a flash of anger at his own weakness, at the way he had allowed himself to be drawn out of the protective shell he had so carefully constructed. "No," Philip said, sharply than intended. "Cancel any engagements I have for the next week. I'll be at the Derbyshire estate. There are matters requiring my attention." It was a lie. The estate ran itself under the capable management of his steward, but Derbyshire was far from London, far from Lady Lennox's drawing room, far from Sophie's laugh and her pressed flowers, and her dangerous insistence that being present in life was somehow more important than preserving grief. Hastings' expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, but his voice remained professionally neutral. "Very good, Your Grace. Shall I send your regrets to Lady Lennox regarding the gallery exhibition you had planned to attend?" Philip felt the words like a knife. The exhibition. He had invited Sophie, had actually looked forward to the afternoon, had allowed himself to anticipate something beyond the gray routine of duty. The realization of how far he had strayed from his carefully maintained path filled him with cold determination. "Send my regrets," Philip confirmed. "Cite pressing business matters, nothing more." The journey to Derbyshire took 2 days, and Philip spent them in a state of deliberate self-flagellation. He forced himself to remember every detail of Catherine's illness, the way consumption had stolen her vitality piece by piece, the helplessness he had felt watching her fade, the final terrible moment when her breathing had simply stopped. He made himself feel
full weight of his failure to save her, to protect her, to be enough to make her want to fight harder to stay alive. By the time he arrived at the estate, he had successfully reconstructed the walls that Sophie had somehow managed to breach. He was once again the Duke of Ashford, the tragic widower, the man whose heart was a memorial to what he had lost. The house welcomed him with its familiar silence. The servants moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, maintaining the careful distance he preferred. He reviewed estate accounts with mechanical precision, rode through the grounds without seeing them, dined alone in the vast dining room where he and Catherine had once hosted dinner parties filled with laughter and conversation. At night, he sat in the library that Catherine had designed, surrounded by books she had selected, and tried to convince himself that this was right, that preserving her memory required preserving his grief, that moving forward would somehow diminish what they had shared. But the argument felt hollow in a way it never had before. Sophie's words echoed in his mind. Beautiful memories shouldn't be forgotten, even when they hurt, perhaps especially when they hurt, because the hurt means the beauty was real. What if honoring Catherine's memory didn't require living in a mausoleum? What if the greatest tribute to what they had shared was to remember how to live the kind of full, engaged life she had exemplified? The thoughts were dangerous, seductive, and Philip pushed them away with the discipline of long practice. He could not afford such thinking. To accept that he might move forward would be to accept that Catherine was truly gone, not just physically, but as the organizing principle of his existence. And if she was not the center of his life anymore, then what had the past 10 years meant? What purpose had his suffering served? On the third night of his self-imposed exile, a letter arrived from London. He recognized Lady Lennox's elegant hand immediately and nearly threw it in the fire unread. But something, curiosity, masochism, or perhaps the last remnant of courtesy made him break the seal. The letter was brief and devastatingly direct. Your Grace, Sophie asked me to convey that she hopes the business matters requiring your urgent attention are resolved satisfactorily, and that she understands if the gallery exhibition must be postponed indefinitely. I, however, am not as gracious as my niece. I have watched you these past weeks, and I have seen something I did not expect to see again. A man remembering how to live. Whatever fear has driven you back into your self-imposed prison, I hope you will consider whether Catherine would truly have wanted you to spend the rest of your life as a monument to her memory, rather than a testament to what she taught you about living fully. Forgive an old woman's impertinence, but grief is not loyalty, Your Grace, and hiding from happiness is not the same as honoring the dead. With regards, Eleanor Lennox. Philip read the letter 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. Lady Lennox's words struck at the very foundation of his carefully constructed worldview, challenging the premise upon which he had built 10 years of existence. He thought of Catherine, truly thought of her, not as an abstraction or a sacred memory, but as the woman he had known and loved. She had been fierce in her love of life, had filled their home with light and laughter, had believed that every day was a gift to be fully experienced. In her final weeks, when the illness had stolen her strength but not her spirit, she had made him promise something he had conveniently chosen to forget. "Don't let this break you, Philip," she had whispered, her hand barely able to squeeze his. "Don't let losing me mean you stop living. Promise me you'll find joy again. Promise me you'll remember that love is meant to expand the heart, not entomb it." He had promised, and then he had spent 10 years breaking that promise, convincing himself that preserving his grief was somehow the same as preserving his love for her. Standing in the library Catherine had designed, surrounded by evidence of her vibrant engagement with the world, Philip finally allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding. He was not honoring Catherine's memory by living as a ghost. He was betraying everything she had valued, everything she had tried to teach him about courage and presence and the precious brevity of life. The guilt that had driven him to Derbyshire transformed into something else, not erasure, but recognition. He could love Catherine's memory and still step into the present. He could honor what they had shared and still allow himself to connect with another person. The two were not mutually exclusive, though he had spent 10 years insisting they must be. But knowing this intellectually and feeling it emotionally were vastly different things. And as Philip sat alone in the library, Lady Lennox's letter crumpled in his hand, he discovered that the weight of guilt was not easily lifted simply because one recognized its irrationality. Change, he realized, would require more than understanding.
It would require a kind of courage he was not certain he possessed, the courage to risk feeling again, knowing that all feeling eventually led to loss. The question was whether the possibility of connection was worth the certainty of eventual pain, and whether he could forgive himself for wanting to find out. Philip returned to London on a grey afternoon that matched his mood perfectly. He had spent a week in Derbyshire accomplishing nothing beyond proving that geographic distance did not ease emotional turmoil. Now, riding through the familiar streets towards Ashford House, he felt the weight of unfinished business settling over him like a shroud. He owed Sophie an explanation, or an apology, or perhaps both, though he was not entirely certain what he would say. The carefully rehearsed speeches he had composed during the journey home dissolved the moment his butler informed him that Miss Hartley had called twice in his absence, leaving her card each time with a simple message, "I hope you are well." No recrimination, no demand for explanation, just genuine concern for his well-being, which somehow made his abandonment feel even more unconscionable. Philip stood in his entrance hall, staring at Sophie's calling cards with their simple, honest messages, and made a decision that surprised him. He would not send a note. He would not wait for a convenient social occasion. He would call on her immediately, propriety be damned, and face whatever consequences his cowardice had earned. Lady Lennox's butler showed him to the morning room with an expression that suggested news of Philip's arrival had both been expected and dreaded. When Sophie entered moments later, Philip felt his carefully prepared words evaporate at the sight of her. She wore a simple day dress of pale blue, and her face showed signs of strain, shadows beneath her eyes that suggested sleepless nights, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of worry contained but not erased. She had been hurt by his disappearance, and the knowledge settled in Philip's chest like a stone. "Your Grace," she said quietly, closing the door behind her with a firmness that suggested this conversation would not be interrupted. "I'm glad you've returned safely. I was beginning to worry." This simple statement, delivered without accusation or manipulation, undid something in Philip's carefully maintained composure. "I'm sorry," he said, the words emerging with more force than intended. "I should have sent word. I should have explained. You should have trusted me," she interrupted gently, moving to stand by the window where afternoon light illuminated her face. The use of his given name, spoken for the first time without his title, felt simultaneously intimate and like a reproach. He had no right to such intimacy, not after the way he had fled.
"I was afraid," he admitted, the truth escaping before he could dress it in more acceptable language. "After the ball, after the dance, I realized I had been happy, and I couldn't remember the last time I had thought of Catherine during an entire hour, much less an entire evening. It felt like betrayal." Sophie turned from the window to face him fully, her expression compassionate but unyielding. "Betrayal of what, exactly? Of her memory? Or of the grief you've been using as armor against the world?" The question struck with surgical precision. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Sophie said simply, "there is. Tell me, what was Catherine like? Not the illness, not the loss, but the woman you married. What did she love? How did she live?" Philip felt his throat tighten. "She loved life. She filled our home with light and laughter. She believed every day was a gift, every moment worth experiencing fully. She was generous and fierce and completely present in everything she did." "And if she could see you now," Sophie said quietly, moving closer, her expression compassionate but unyielding, "spending 10 years in a mausoleum of your own making, refusing to live because she cannot, what would she think of that? Would she consider it a tribute or a tragedy?" The words hit Philip like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. "You have no right." "I have every right," Sophie interrupted, her voice still gentle but carrying an edge of steel. "Because I care about you, and I'm watching you choose death while you're still breathing. The dead don't want us to join them before our time, Philip. They don't want us to stop living simply because they had to. That's not love. That's just fear wearing love's face." Philip felt something crack inside him, a fissure running through the foundation he had built his entire existence upon. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Sophie said. "You think that if you stop grieving, you'll stop loving her. That if you allow yourself to be happy again, it will somehow diminish what you shared. But that's not how love works, Philip. Love doesn't have limits. Your heart is not a finite resource that can only hold one person at a time." "She asked me to promise something," Philip said, the words emerging like a confession. "In her final days, she made me promise I would find joy again, that I wouldn't let losing her mean I stopped living. And I promised her. And then I spent 10 years breaking that promise, because I convinced myself that grief was loyalty." Sophie's expression softened with understanding. "And now you're caught between two promises, the one you made to her and the one you made to yourself about never forgetting." "Yes," Philip breathed, grateful that she understood without him having to explain further. Sophie crossed the remaining distance between them, stopping just close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of lavender. "But those promises aren't contradictory, Philip. You can honor Catherine's memory and still step into the present. You can love what you had with her and still allow yourself to feel something for someone else. The heart isn't a museum where everything must remain exactly as it was. It's a living thing, meant to grow and expand and hold multiple truths at once." "I don't know how," Philip admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I've spent so long being the grieving widower that I've forgotten how to be anything else. When I'm with you, I feel like I'm betraying her. But when I'm alone, I feel like I'm betraying myself. I don't know which is worse." "Neither is worse," Sophie firmly, "because neither is true. You're not betraying Catherine by living, and you're not betraying yourself by honoring what you lost. You're just human, Philip. You're just a man caught between past and present, trying to figure out how to carry love forward rather than being buried by it." Philip found himself staring at her, this woman who had somehow managed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses to the terrified man beneath. "How are you so certain about all this?" "I'm not certain about anything," Sophie admitted with a small, sad smile. "But I've learned that certainty is overrated. What matters is being willing to try, to risk, to step forward even when you're not sure where you're stepping. Life is too short and too precious to spend it frozen in place, no matter how good the reasons for freezing seem. And if I step forward and fail, if I try to move past this and discover I can't, if I hurt you in the process..." Sophie reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Philip, you're already hurting me by not trying. You're already failing by choosing isolation over connection. The question isn't whether trying will be difficult or whether you might fail. It's whether you're willing to risk failure in order to have a chance at something more than mere existence." Philip looked down at their joined hands, feeling the simple human contact like an electric current running through him. For 10 years, he had avoided such moments, had carefully maintained physical and emotional distance from everyone around him. Now, holding Sophie's hand in Lady Lennox's morning room, he felt the full weight of what he had denied himself. Not just romantic connection, but simple human warmth, the basic comfort of being known and accepted despite his flaws. "I'm afraid," he said simply, the admission costing him more than he would have thought possible. "I know," Sophie replied, squeezing his hand gently. "But the question is whether you're more afraid of trying and possibly failing, or of spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you'd had the courage to step forward." Philip thought of Catherine, of her fierce love of life, of the way she had faced her own death with courage and grace, while making him promise not to let fear make him small. He thought of the past 10 years, of the gray fog of mourning that had become his entire world. And he thought of Sophie, standing before him with her hand in his, offering not salvation or rescue, but simply the possibility of connection, of presence, of being alive in more than just the technical sense. "The dead don't want us to join them before our time," he repeated softly, testing the words. "Catherine would be furious if she could see how I've been living."
Then perhaps, Sophie suggested gently, live in a way that would make her proud instead of perpetuating a grief that only honors your fear. And standing in the afternoon light with Sophie's hand warm in his, Philip felt the weight of guilt begin to transform into something else. Not erasure of the past, but permission to step into the future without abandoning what he had lost. It was, he realized, the first step to healing. And like all first steps, it was terrifying and necessary. Philip had suggested a walk in Hyde Park, neutral territory, where they could talk without the weight of drawing rooms and social expectations. Sophie had agreed with characteristic directness, meeting him at the Grosvenor Deed entrance wearing a walking dress of warm burgundy and a Spencer jacket that brought color to her cheeks in the crisp November air. They walked in silence at first, the kind of companionable quiet that Philip was beginning to recognize as one of Sophie's gifts. She did not feel compelled to fill every moment with words, did not mistake silence for awkwardness. Around them, the park was alive with the final burst of autumn color, leaves of gold and crimson still clinging stubbornly to branches despite the inevitability of winter. "I used to walk here with Catherine," Philip said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. "In the early years of our marriage. She loved watching the seasons change, said it was nature's way of reminding us that transformation was not only inevitable, but beautiful." Sophie glanced at him with those perceptive eyes, but said nothing, simply adjusted her pace to match his as they followed the serpentine path deeper into the park. "I haven't walked here for pleasure in 10 years, Philip continued, finding that once he had started speaking about Catherine, the words came easier. "I ride through in the mornings, but always early, always efficient, never just to observe, to notice, to experience. And now?" Sophie prompted gently. "Now I'm noticing that you have a small ink stain on your left hand," Philip said, nodding towards the telltale mark, "and that you walk slightly faster than is strictly fashionable, as if you're always eager to reach the next destination, and that when you think no one is watching, you smile to nothing in particular, just because the day exists and you're part of it." Sophie looked down at her ink-stained fingers with a rueful expression. "I was writing letters to the children in the literacy program this morning. One of them asked me to describe London, and I found myself using quite a lot of ink trying to capture it in words." "And what did you tell them?" Philip asked, genuinely curious. "That it's overwhelming and magnificent and slightly absurd all at once. That it's full of people performing elaborate dances while pretending they're simply walking through life. That it has moments of unexpected beauty tucked into corners where you least expect them, like finding a pressed flower in a book about agricultural management." The reference to their collision outside Hatchard's brought a warmth to Philip's chest. "That seems remarkably accurate." "I try," Sophie said with a small smile. Then more seriously, "Philip, may I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," he replied, meaning it.
When was the last time you laughed? Not a polite acknowledgement of humor, but actual laughter. The kind that catches you by surprise and escapes before you can contain it. The question stopped Philip in his tracks, literally. He stood on the path, staring at a particularly magnificent oak tree, trying to remember. The answer, when it came, was devastating in its simplicity. "I can't remember," he admitted quietly. "It must have been before Catherine's illness became severe, perhaps 3 or 4 years into our marriage. After that, there didn't seem to be much to laugh about, and after she died," he trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "That's too long," Sophie said firmly. "Far too long for anyone to go without laughing. It's not healthy, Philip. Laughter is how we release tension, how we acknowledge the absurdity of existence, how we remind ourselves that even in darkness there can be moments of lightness." "I wouldn't know where to begin," Philip confessed. "I've forgotten how." Sophie's eyes lit with something that might have been mischief. "Then perhaps we should practice. Come with me." Before Philip could protest, Sophie had taken his hand and was leading him off the main path toward a more secluded area of the park. They emerged into a small clearing where an enterprising vendor had set up what appeared to be some sort of entertainment, a performing monkey in a tiny waistcoat accompanied by an organ grinder playing enthusiastically off-key melodies. "Oh, this is perfect," Sophie said with evident delight. "Look at him, he's wearing a top hat." The monkey was indeed wearing a miniature top hat which kept sliding over his eyes as he performed increasingly elaborate tricks for the small crowd that had gathered. Every time the hat fell, the monkey would adjust it with an air of wounded dignity, only to have it fall again moments later during his next acrobatic feat. "He's very determined," Philip observed, watching as the monkey attempted a somersault that sent the hat flying entirely. "He's very terrible at wearing hats," Sophie corrected, and there was something in her tone, a bubbling amusement barely contained that made Philip look at her rather than the monkey. Her face was alight with genuine mirth, her eyes sparkling with the kind of uncomplicated joy that came from witnessing something ridiculous and allowing oneself to be delighted by it. And as the monkey retrieved his hat, placed it carefully on his head, struck a pose of aristocratic dignity, and then immediately sneezed so violently that the hat flew off again, Sophie dissolved into laughter. It was infectious, that laugh, full-bodied and uninhibited and absolutely genuine. And watching her, seeing the way joy transformed her entire being, Philip felt something crack inside him. Not painfully, but rather like ice breaking up in spring, releasing what had been frozen beneath. The monkey, apparently encouraged by the laughter, attempted an even more elaborate trick, a handstand that resulted in his tiny waistcoat riding up over his head while the hat fell directly onto the organ grinder's face. And Philip laughed. It started as a chuckle, rusty and uncertain, as if his facial muscles had forgotten the mechanics of such an expression. But then it built, growing stronger and more genuine, until he was laughing in a way he had not laughed in over a decade, helplessly, joyfully, without reservation or control. Sophie turned to him, her own laughter momentarily suspended by surprise and something that looked remarkably like triumph. "You're laughing," she said unnecessarily, her face radiant. "I'm laughing," Philip confirmed, and the admission made him laugh harder, because it was absurd. The Duke of Ashford, the tragic widower, the man who never smiled, laughing at a performing monkey in a park on a Tuesday afternoon. When the laughter finally subsided, leaving Philip slightly breathless and oddly energized, he became aware that his face felt different, strange. And then he realized his mouth was curved upward, his cheeks slightly ached from the unfamiliar position. He was smiling. Not the polite social smile he had occasionally deployed for appearances, but a genuine smile, unrehearsed and unguarded. It felt foreign and familiar at once, like returning to a home he had not realized he was homesick for. "The world hasn't ended," Sophie said softly, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "You laughed and smiled, and the sky didn't fall. You're still here. Catherine's memory is still intact. Nothing terrible has happened." "No," Philip agreed, covering her hand with his own. "Nothing terrible at all. In fact, something rather wonderful just happened." "And what was that?" Philip looked at her, this extraordinary woman who had somehow managed to lead him back to himself, who had shown him that grief and joy were not mutually exclusive, that honoring the past did not require abandoning the present. "I remembered what it feels like to be alive," Philip said simply. "Not just existing, not just breathing and moving through the motions, but actually alive, present in the moment, connected to something beyond my own grief." Sophie's smile was radiant, and Philip felt answering warmth bloom in his chest. Not guilt, not fear, but something that felt remarkably like hope. "It suits you," she said quietly. "That smile. You should wear it more often." "I'm terribly out of practice," Philip replied, and was surprised to find himself smiling wider. "I may need help remembering." "Well then," Sophie said, linking her arm through his as they turned back towards the main path, "it's fortunate that I'm quite experienced at finding absurdity in everyday moments. Between performing monkeys and overly elaborate social rituals, London provides ample opportunities for practice." As they walked back through the park, Philip found his face maintained its unfamiliar upward curve. He was smiling, actually smiling, and the sensation was strange and wonderful. He had spent 10 years convinced that allowing himself such moments would somehow betray Catherine's memory, would diminish the love they had shared. But standing in Hyde Park with Sophie, having just laughed at a monkey in a top hat, Philip understood something fundamental. Catherine had not wanted him to stop living. She had wanted him to carry forward the joy they had shared, to honor their love not by preserving it in amber, but by allowing it to inform how he moved through the world. The first smile in 10 years felt like the first breath after being underwater, painful, necessary, and absolutely essential to survival. And as Sophie squeezed his arm gently, her own smile warm and knowing, Philip felt that the world had not ended when he allowed himself to feel joy again. It had, in fact, just begun. The first snow of winter arrived on a Thursday morning, transforming London into something resembling a fairy tale. Philip stood at his study window, watching the flakes drift past, and realized for the first time in a decade he wasn't dreading the approaching winter. Instead, he found himself thinking about walks through snow-covered parks, warm fires, and the way Sophie's eyes would light up at the transformation of the familiar landscape. He realized, with something close to wonder, anticipating the future rather than simply enduring it. The past 3 weeks had brought changes both subtle and profound. Philip had not become a different person. Grief had left its marks, carved channels in his soul that would always remain. But he had learned to distinguish between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it, between remembering Catherine and using her memory as an excuse to avoid living. And Sophie had been there through it all, patient but uncompromising, offering not rescue, but companionship on a journey he ultimately had to make himself. This morning, however, was different. This morning marked his return to society, not as the tragic Duke performing obligatory appearances, but as Philip Ashford, a man who had discovered that joy was not betrayal and that his heart was large enough to hold both memory and present connection. Lady Pemberton's winter luncheon would be the perfect testing ground, small enough to be manageable, but large enough that their appearance together would be noted and discussed. Philip had discussed the implications with Sophie the previous evening over tea in Lady Lennox's drawing room. "You understand what this means," he said carefully. "The ton will talk, they will speculate, they will create narratives about us that may or may not bear any resemblance to reality."
Sophie had smiled with that characteristic mixture of amusement and wisdom. "They're already talking, Philip. They have been since the ball. The question is whether we're going to live our lives based on their narratives or our own." Now, as Philip's carriage arrived at Lady Lennox's townhouse to collect Sophie, he felt nervousness flutter in his chest. Not the dread of social obligation, but the anticipation of being seen, truly seen, as a man stepping back into life. Sophie emerged wearing a gown of deep sapphire trimmed with silver, her hair arranged elegantly, but with a few deliberately casual curls that softened the formality. She looked radiant, alive, and when she saw him waiting beside the carriage, her face lit with a smile that made something warm bloom in Philip's chest. "Your Grace," she said with mock formality, then softer, "Philip, you look happy." "I am happy," Philip replied, surprised by how easily the admission came. "Nervous, but happy. Is that allowed?" "It's required," Sophie said, taking his offered hand to step into the carriage. "Although I should warn you, my aunt has been practically vibrating with anticipation all morning. I believe she's taking personal credit for this entire development." Philip felt his mouth curve, the smile coming easier now, though still unfamiliar enough to feel like a small victory each time. "Lady Lennox has earned some credit. Her letter to me in Derbyshire was remarkably direct." "She's a meddling romantic," Sophie said fondly, "but she meddles with good intentions." As the carriage made its way through snow-dusted streets toward Lady Pemberton's residence, Philip found himself observing London with new eyes. The city he had moved through like a ghost for 10 years suddenly seemed alive with possibility, shop windows glowing warmly against the winter afternoon, vendors calling their wares with cheerful determination, children attempting to gather enough snow for snowballs despite the light dusting. "What are you thinking?" Sophie asked, watching his face with gentle curiosity. "That I had forgotten how beautiful the world is when you actually look at it," Philip replied. "That I spent 10 years staring at the ground, afraid that looking up might make me feel something, and now I'm wondering how much I missed."
You can't reclaim lost time, Sophie said gently, but you can stop wasting the time you have left. The wisdom in her words, delivered without judgment or pressure, made Philip reach for her hand. She laced her fingers through his without hesitation, the gesture as natural as breathing. Lady Pemberton's drawing room was already filled with London's elite when they arrived. Philip felt the moment of silence as they were announced together, felt the collective intake of breath, saw the sudden susurration of whispered speculation. The Duke of Ashford arriving with Miss Hartley, the tragic widower smiling, the man who never attended social functions now seeking them out. The change was too significant to ignore, too dramatic not to comment upon. Philip felt Sophie's hand tighten slightly on his arm, a gesture of support and solidarity, and instead of the expected anxiety, he felt something closer to defiance. Let them whisper, let them create their narratives. He was done living according to their expectations, done performing the role of perpetual mourning they had assigned him. "Your Grace, Miss Hartley," Lady Pemberton approached with barely contained delight. "How wonderful to see you both. Come, you must join our discussion about the proposed reforms to the poor laws." As they moved into the gathering, Philip noticed the reactions, some approving, some shocked, some calculating how this development might affect the social landscape. But he also noticed something else: warmth from those who had known him before Catherine's death, genuine pleasure from friends who had watched him retreat into grief and were now witnessing his emergence. Lord Pemberton approached with a broad smile. "Ashford, good to see you looking so well. And Miss Hartley, your work with the literacy program has been the talk of every charitable committee in London." Throughout the luncheon, Philip found himself engaged in actual conversation rather than performing social obligation. He laughed at witty observations, contributed to debates with genuine interest, and most remarkably, allowed himself to simply be present in the moment without the constant undercurrent of grief coloring every interaction. And through it all, Sophie was beside him, not as decoration or trophy, but as genuine companion, someone who challenged him intellectually, supported him emotionally, and reminded him with every laugh and thoughtful observation that life was meant to be lived rather than endured. At one point, as they stood near the windows watching the snow fall more heavily, Lady Lennox appeared at Helix's elbow. "You're smiling," she observed with satisfaction. "Actually smiling, not just moving your mouth in the appropriate direction." "I am," Philip confirmed, glancing at Sophie, who was engaged in animated conversation with several ladies about expanding the literacy program. "Catherine would be pleased," Lady Lennox said quietly. "She always said you had the capacity for great joy. She would hate knowing that losing her had made you forget that." Philip felt the familiar ache at Catherine's name, but it was different now, bittersweet rather than devastating, acknowledgement rather than consuming pain. "I think she would like Sophie," he said, "both fierce in their love of life, both unwilling to accept half measures or comfortable lies." "High praise indeed," Lady Lennox said with knowing eyes. "And what are your intentions toward my niece, if I may be so bold?" Philip turned to face her directly. "Honorable ones, though I'm not certain I'm ready to define them more specifically yet. I'm still learning how to be present in my own life, how to feel without fearing the inevitable loss that comes with all feeling." "That's honest, at least," Lady Lennox said. "Sophie deserves honesty above all else." As the afternoon drew to a close and they prepared to depart, Philip found himself reluctant to end the gathering, not because he feared returning to solitude, but because he genuinely did not want the pleasure of the afternoon to conclude. When had that last happened? When had he last wanted time to slow down rather than speed up? In the carriage returning to Lady Lennox's residence, Sophie leaned against his shoulder with comfortable familiarity. "You did beautifully," she said quietly. "I'm proud of you." "I had help," Philip replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture of affection that felt both natural and revolutionary. "You've taught me that the opposite of grief is not happiness, but presence. That honoring why lost means living fully rather than existing partially." "You taught yourself that," Sophie corrected gently. "I just reminded you that you already knew it." As they stood at Lady Lennox's door, snow falling around them in the gathering twilight, Philip took both of Sophie's hands in his. "I don't know what the future holds," he said honestly. "I don't know if I'll always be this present, this capable of joy. I imagine there will be difficult days when the grief returns full force, but I know that I don't want to face those days alone anymore. I know that you've shown me what it means to truly live, and I want to keep learning that lesson with you beside me." Sophie's smile was radiant even in the fading light. "That's all anyone can ask for, Philip. Not certainty or perfection, but willingness, the courage to keep choosing life even when loss has taught you how much life can hurt." Philip felt his own smile, genuine, unrehearsed, born of joy rather than obligation. The Duke who had not smiled in 10 years had remembered how. More importantly, he had remembered why. Not to perform happiness, but to acknowledge that even in a world where loss was inevitable, beauty and connection and love were worth the risk. As he rode home through the snow-covered streets, Philip thought of Catherine and felt gratitude rather than anguish. She had taught him how to love deeply. Sophie was teaching him that love did not have to end when life did, that the heart was resilient enough to hold both memory and new affection, both past and present. The grandfather clock would still tick in his library tonight, marking time with relentless precision, but Philip would no longer hear it as a metronome of life standing still. Instead, he would hear it as what it truly was, a measure of moments passing, each one an opportunity to choose presence over paralysis, connection over isolation, life over mere existence. The Duke of Shadows had stepped into light, and while shadows would always remain, grief is not something one overcame so much as learned to carry. They no longer defined him. He was Philip Ashford. He had loved and lost and learned to love again. He had discovered that the ultimate healing was not forgetting the past, but integrating it into a present that honored what was lost by refusing to waste what remained. As the first snow of winter continued to fall, transforming London into something new while remaining fundamentally itself, Philip understood that this was what rebirth looked like, not erasure, but transformation, not forgetting, but remembering how to live despite and because of what memory held. Love had broken him, and love, in its infinite complexity, had proven to be the ultimate healer after all.